On the issues, is Simmons much more aware of these issues? Is he much more substantive? Yes, he is. There's no question. I mean, I've sat on a panel with all the candidates, and you have Richard Blumenthal sort of shaky and reading his notes and trying to stick to what his posters gave him. You have McMahon just giving these sort of hallmark sound bites. And again, although I disagree with Rob Simmons on many things, when you listen to Simmons speak about these issues, he speaks intelligently. He speaks as a guy who's traveled the world. He speaks as a guy who's served in uniform and been decorated for his action, been wounded overseas in Vietnam. He can speak intelligently of these issues. But at the end of the day, he's facing a tsunami of world wrestling money. So if I had to guess, I think McMahon is their nominee. And again, one of the things I've seen over the last year in traveling this state, when I'm there at Democratic Town Committee meetings, when you talk with Democrats and you get the pulse of Democrats, with thousands of Democrats I've met across the state in the last year, Democrats, the wind is out of the Democrat sails. And I think if you saw what happened in Massachusetts and how Scott Brown beat Coakley, I think you see the fear, the writing on the wall. And at a practical level, the Republicans and right-leaning independents are energized. When I'll go and do events, normally the way this works, during the day I'll do more open forums. So if I'm at a Rotary Club, for example, or a Lions Club or something of the sort, when I will be there for an event, then you obviously have Democrats, but you have Republicans and you have independents. It's really a sort of a general electorate audience versus the evenings where it's the Democrats. If I look at how energized those Republicans are and those right-leaning independents during the day when I visit with those people, they want to beat the Democrats at all cost. And then if I look at how many of the Democrats are sort of disheartened and dispirited, that's a real concern. Because with Linda McMahon's money and with an energized Republican base, that's a dangerous combination for Democrats.
So how are you reaching out to progressives and Greens and liberal independents?
The basic way that I do it is going to, there are several components. First, it's going to those Democratic Town Committee meetings, right, and saying to people, very openly saying, I'm Merrick Alpert, I represent the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. I'm running because I want a progressive Democrat to win this seat, and I don't want Linda McMahon to buy it. And I'm very direct in front of those audiences each night. I'll be in front of another Democratic Town Committee tonight, and I will do exactly the same thing. I'll convey to them, if you are a progressive, I want you to join me. If you're just going to go on with whoever the party tells you to go with, I'm not your guy. But if you're an individual who's thinking about this stuff and you're progressive, I want you to join me. So there's a base of support you get from those folks. On top of it, I go and speak at college campuses throughout the state. And that's a good way that we've tied folks in. For example, by doing that, we have a great group of interns from the University of Connecticut and from other schools throughout Connecticut. And they're young, they're bright, they're hardworking. That's a good way to build the base. And then obviously there are other groups that I'll go to. I'll go to, for example, on Saturday evening, I'm speaking in Connecticut at a very progressive church to an assembly of people who oppose the war. And this has been a group of people who've been actively involved in the peace movement. So I'll go there and lay it out. Right? I'll explain to them why Afghanistan doesn't make sense, why we're not winning the war, it's not in our national security interest, not in our economic interest. That's a good base of people. I'll do other things like my walk across the state. I walk across the state of Connecticut, 117 miles in 4.5 days on Route 1 from the Rhode Island border to the New York border to express my opposition to Afghanistan.
This was last November.
That's right, and that got wide media attention throughout the state. And in the progressive community, that was very substantive because someone said point blank in a video they did about us, they said, that talk about a guy who's walking the walk and not just talking the talk. You know, and in asking everybody, have you ever heard of anybody walking across the state 117 miles? I said, no, I've never heard of that. So you would go, and sure enough, people who were activists in the progressive community would join you. And what's interesting is, at that point, there were a bunch of them who joined me who weren't really sure how they felt about Afghanistan. And yet they would join, and then months later they'd say, you know, I'm coming to the conclusion you were right on Afghanistan.
Right.
And one of the things you have to do when you're with folks is you have to be passionate. You have to explain why you believe what you believe, and you have to say to them, look, I need you to join me. And when I talk about Afghanistan, for example, I'll say, when you look at this thing, it doesn't make sense. I mean, however you break it down, we support a corrupt and ineffectual government in Hamid Karzai, that we send more than $1 billion of aid a year to Pakistan. Millions of those dollars are then used against us in Afghanistan.
Basically, and we're only looking for 3 or 4 dozen guys, right?
Pretty scary. Pretty scary. General Jones, our national security advisor, literally said that. He said that you've got less than 100 active members of Al-Qaeda on the ground in Afghanistan, and yet we're going to put in 100,000 uniformed troops. This isn't how you wage and win modern warfare. This looks like a relic of the Cold War, and it just doesn't make sense. So part of it is when people see you out there in the community, if they see you speak at a church, if they see you walking, if they see you on the news, and they realize, wow, this guy's walking the walk, that is how you draw people in. That's how you draw people in. And as you know, the key is always to try to get a big enough megaphone, and try to draw these people in. And that's the challenge. I'm of the belief that if I could get in front of every person in this state, I'd win in a landslide. But the problem is, you don't have time to get in front of every person, and so obviously you have to use the media as your method of doing it.
Well, when you say that you come from the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party, to me that reads, as code for progressive.
It is, and I self-identify as being a progressive. And what that means to me is that I am not driven by old school politics. I'm not driven by a bunch of hack politicians, and I'm certainly not driven by what's politically expedient at that time of day. Okay? What I'm driven by is working on issues, whether it's the issue of the economy, and realizing that the sort of safe little sound bites and the safe little maneuvers of career politicians aren't going to get it done. So I'll look and say, look, I support a big, bold plan to reinvest in America, $200 billion a year over 5 years. Let's get this thing done. Let's recreate this economy. Let's build jobs. If I look on healthcare, the notion of sort of nibbling around the edges and creating new insurance products for the for-profit companies, that doesn't make sense to me. So I look at the thing and say, look, I support a single-payer system. I support a Medicare program for everybody. Right? Now, you look a couple of weeks ago, I'm on a panel there with the other Senate candidates. Blumenthal graced us with his presence at that one. And he sat there and told these insurance executives, this is a breakfast in Hartford with all these insurance executives, he sat there and said, well, I know I've sued you for 20 years, but as a senator, I'd fight for your industry, I'd be your friend, I'll be, this hope that everybody has kind of collective amnesia. And I said to them, when I got up to speak, I said, look, this is a wake-up call, right? I didn't come here to tell you what you want to hear. I'm going to be perfectly blunt. I don't think that the president's plan goes far enough. I believe in a single-payer system. I believe in Medicare for all. Now, I believe that beyond that, there can be a strong secondary insurance market, right, or a fee-for-service program. And that can be based in Hartford, Connecticut. But the notion that the economic self-interest of a handful of folks in this room is going to override my responsibility to take care of all these folks in Connecticut and the people in this nation, that just ain't reality. That's just not, I'm not going to say that. And I understand you might want to hear that. I'm not going to say it. And afterward, what's fascinating is when people come up to you and say, I disagree with you on some of these things, but it's so refreshing to have somebody actually stand up and say something, right, and not just try to play this game where you're this weird chameleon and you sort of morph yourself depending upon which group you're in front of. A friend of mine who traveled with me, came from California and spent a couple of days with me on the campaign trail. He said, what's wild is no matter where you go, you say the same thing. Your positions don't change. I said, why would they? When I'm in front of the folks at my VFW hall, when I'm in front of the American Legion and speaking to the annual convention, I say to them, I absolutely, totally, completely and unconditionally support our men and women in uniform. But I absolutely, totally, completely and unconditionally think that this war is not in our national security interest. Right? And I'm not going to sit here and tell you something else because you might want to hear something else. And anybody who does that nonsense, you ought not vote for. And people are stunned by the honesty. I mean, they're just shocked by it. They just say, wow, people don't usually run for office and talk that way. And I said, exactly, which is why I'm running for office.
Honesty and guts. It's refreshing. Yeah. And people are hungry for it.